The aspirant's name was already gone from the ledger before his ribcage finished breaking. I stood at the lectern of bone and brass, the purity litanies rolling from my tongue in measured cadence, each syllable timed to the apothecary's incisions. The chamber smelled of counterseptic solution and heated metal, and something beneath both of those things that I had learned, over 3 selection cycles, to stop identifying. The lumens overhead were fixed and white, and cast no shadow worth naming. Every surface in the gene vault gleamed. The fortress monastery kept its surgical theatres immaculate, not from concern for infection, but from reverence for the sacred work conducted within them. Cleanliness was doctrinal. The absence of shadow was doctrinal. The boy on the slab was 12 years old, or had been, in the counting of the feral world from which the chapter's tithe ships had drawn him. He no longer had a name in the ledger. I had made that mark myself, 20 minutes prior, when the apothecary had indicated that the first biometric readings following osmodular insertion had fallen below the threshold margin. Not below survivability, I should clarify. Below the line, we used to distinguish between aspirants who would complete the rite of second implantation and aspirants who would not. Those 2 populations require different record keeping. The surviving population had names. The other population had unit designations and viability flags for organ reclamation. The apothecary had looked at the slate in my hands, had looked at the numbers, and had made a small sound in the back of his throat that I had come to understand as confirmation. I had drawn a single thin line through the entry. The name had read Corvus Thane, which was a name that would have been unusual on most worlds, but was common enough among the Highland clans of Verath IV, where the chapter recruited in its northern cycles. The line I drew was straight. I have always drawn straight lines. The Biscopea had been inserted 11 minutes earlier. The osmodular followed it at the 8-minute mark, guided by the apothecary's tools with the kind of precision that comes from performing the same procedure several hundred times over a career that had begun decades before I entered the apothecarian's administrative division. The boy's chest had been opened along the sternum. His breathing was shallow and medicated. He could not scream, but I had learned that unconsciousness during forced skeletal expansion was a matter of degree rather than certainty. The sedation dulled. It did not extinguish. The litany continued. Blessed are the vessels of the Emperor's will. Blessed are the bones that conform to sacred purpose. I am the gene scribe adjutant assigned to the 3rd selection cycle of this campaign year, and my function during the rite of second implantation is threefold. Recite the purity litanies at the correct cadence, monitor and record all biometric deviations on the slate, and confirm viability classifications in real time so that the apothecary can proceed without administrative interruption. I am not a surgeon. I am not a chaplain. I am the record. The rib cage fractured inward on the left side first. I know this because I could hear it. The sound was not dramatic. It was the kind of creak that old wood makes when weight is placed on it unexpectedly, followed by a sharp single note that the surgical theatre's walls absorbed almost immediately. The forced growth of the os modula, acting on bone that had not had sufficient time to adapt. The apothecary's eyes did not move from his instruments. My litany continued. Blessed is the suffering of the worthy, for it is the proof of the Emperor's regard. The biometric line on my slate jumped and then stabilized at a lower position than it had occupied before. I recorded the fracture. I noted the time. I noted the current position in the litany. It was the apothecary who corrected me. He said, without turning, that my cadence had altered, that I had introduced a half-second hesitation between the fourth and fifth lines of the third invocation. He said this the way one might mention a small error in arithmetic, an unremarkable thing that nonetheless required correction. I straightened my posture and resumed at the proper pace. The litany continued. The aspirant's chest continued its slow and terrible accommodation of the sacred material being forced into it. I understood then, in a way that I would spend the rest of the cycle trying to unpack and then trying to ignore, that he had not commented on the fracture. He had commented on my tone. The surgery was proceeding correctly. The problem was my voice. The shift was subtle. The chant felt heavier than the body on the slab. When the rite was complete, I transferred the aspirant's biometric file to the reclamation queue. The entry received a new designation. Viability markers were assessed. Certain implanted organs had taken root sufficiently to be recoverable. This was a good outcome, in the sense that the gene seed would not be wasted. I signed the bottom of the form. My signature was clear and undramatic. I had been trained to sign with clarity. The gene vaults of this fortress monastery occupied the deepest levels beneath the mountain, and the rite of second implantation was one of many procedures conducted simultaneously across a dozen operating theatres. During the closing days of a selection cycle, I was assigned to Theatre 7. I was not privy to the full casualty counts from the other theatres until the end of the shift, when the compiled summary arrived on my slate through the apothecarian's internal vox relay. I reviewed it in the narrow corridor outside the theatre, while the sterilization cycle ran behind me. The numbers exceeded doctrinal margin. The acceptable deviation for second implantation loss was documented in the apothecarian's procedural codex as 14% across a single cycle phase. The compiled summary indicated 19.3%. I read this 3 times. I was not certain what I expected to happen as a result of reading it a 3rd time, but the number did not change. 19.3, 5 3/10 percentage points above the accepted threshold. In raw terms, across all theatres combined, this represented 11 additional aspirants who had not survived the rite and had not been projected to fail. I brought the summary to the presiding apothecary at the end of the shift. He reviewed it for perhaps 4 seconds. He told me that the losses were within deviation. I indicated the documented threshold. He told me that the threshold represented historical guidance, not structural limit, and that the quality of the current cohort from Vareth 4 had introduced additional variance factors that the standard margins did not account for. He told me to file the summary under cycle data and note the deviation as an environmental adjustment factor. I returned to my archive cell and filed the summary. Then I looked at the ledger, not the compiled summary, but the full ledger, which I maintained myself and which contained every aspirant admitted to the 3rd selection cycle by name, tithe world origin, initial biometric classification, and current status. I had been maintaining this ledger since the first day of the cycle. It was thorough. I was thorough. I noticed, reviewing it, that several names had received unit designation transfers and reclamation flags before the death confirmation entries had been filed. In some cases, the gap between the two was small, minutes or under an hour. In 2 cases, the gap was longer. One entry a boy from the southern coastal clans of Verath IV, whose name had been marked as unpronounceable in the standard Gothic script, and who had been assigned the designation Aspirant 1414 in the official system, showed a reclamation flag filed 40 minutes before the death confirmation. I sat with this for some time. Or the ledger did not track survival. It tracked yield. I made no notation about this in the official record. I was not certain what notation I would have made had I attempted one. I sat in my archive cell with the ledger open on the data slate in my hands, and the recycled air of the mountain moving through the ventilation grills above my head. And I thought about the line I had drawn through Corvus Thane's name. A straight line. I have always drawn straight lines. The third selection cycle had begun with 207 aspirants. I did not know yet how many would remain when it ended. The fortress monastery of the chapter rose in tiers above the gene vaults, each level ascending through function towards something approaching sanctity. The surgical theatres were at the base. Above them were the recovery wards, where surviving aspirants were monitored through the initial period of implantation, their bodies conducting the agonizing internal negotiations between human tissue and the Emperor's genetic legacy. Above the recovery wards were the training facilities, which occupied the mountain's midsections, combat arenas carved into black stone, hypno-indoctrination chapels fitted with suspension rigs, refectories where food was dispensed by the calorie and supplement rather than by preference or hunger. Above these were the administrative wings, the armories, the chaplaincy, the librarium. At the very peak, accessible only to full battle brothers of the chapter, were the reliquary vaults and the banner hall. I occupied a cell in the administrative wing. It was not large. It contained a cot, a writing surface, a data slate terminal, a shelf for personal effects, and a luminary that I could adjust between 2 levels of brightness. I had been assigned this cell at the beginning of my 3rd year in the Apothecarian's administrative division, when my predecessor had been elevated to full gene scribe status and transferred to the primary apothecary's staff. I had moved into the cell and arranged the few objects I possessed on the shelf, and learned the sound the ventilation system made through the night, and found that I was comfortable there, in the way that one becomes comfortable in spaces that impose no requirement of personality. I had been born on the same feral world that supplied the chapter's tithe aspirants, though I had been selected not for martial potential, but for cognitive aptitude and physical limitation. I was too tall for the gene seed to take properly. This is a specific and unforgiving calculus. The os modular works within parameters. Those parameters are not generous. I had been assessed at 14 and found to be outside the acceptable range for implantation candidacy and within the acceptable range for administrative service. I had been given this information plainly, without ceremony, by the recruiting sergeant who had travelled to my clan settlement in the Verath IV Highlands during the intake season. I had said, "I am grateful for the chapter's consideration." The sergeant had written something on a slate and moved on to the next candidate. I had spent the next 4 years in basic administrative training at the lower fortress levels before being assigned to the apothecarian as a scribe assistant. I had learned the purity litanies, the biometric recording protocols, the classification systems for implantation failure modes, the correct forms for gene seed reclamation documentation. I had learned that the work was precise and that precision was valued, and that value within the chapter's administrative structure was expressed through continued assignment rather than verbal affirmation. No one praised me for accurate records. Accurate records were the function. inaccuracy would have been noted. I believed in the work. I want to be clear about this, because the clarity matters for what follows. I was not performing belief. I understood, in the way one understands arithmetic or atmospheric composition, that the creation of space marines was among the most sacred acts the Imperium conducted, that the chapter's gene seed, entrusted to them through a line of succession, reaching back to the first founding, was a trust not of material, but of divine potential, that aspirants who entered the rite of second implantation were engaging with a process older than almost any surviving institution in the galaxy, that the pain was real and the death was real, and both of those things were inseparable from the sanctity of what was being made. The boy on the slab might become something that had stood against the darkness for 10,000 years, or he might become viable organ material. Both outcomes served the chapter. The doctrine said this plainly. I had read it in the Apothecarian's procedural codex, and in the supplementary theological commentary, and in the liturgical texts that framed the purity litanies I recited at the lectern. Mortality was not failure. It was selection. The gene seed was testing its candidates the way a blade tests metal. Only what survived the test deserved to carry the legacy forward. I believed this. The arithmetic of sacrifice was a stable truth. Each death confirmed the standard. Each survival proved the standard could be met. The ledger of yield was not a document of cruelty. It was a document of sacred design. I returned to Theatre 7 the following morning for the continuation of the third selection cycle's second implantation phase, and I stood at the lectern of bone and brass, and I recited the purity litanies at the correct cadence, and I recorded all biometric deviations on the slate, and I drew straight lines when straight lines were required, and I did not hesitate between the fourth and fifth lines of the third invocation. The next two aspirants to occupy the slab were both classified as surviving the rite. I recorded their names in the survival column. Their names were Aedan and Ferrus, which were also clan names common to the Verith Four Highlands. I did not know them as individuals. I knew their biometric profiles. I knew their intake assessments and their hypno-indoctrination response scores, and their bone density readings taken at the beginning of the cycle. I knew that Aedan had shown slight osmodular resistance in the pre-rite evaluation, which had been corrected with additional hormonal preparation. I knew that Ferrus had a second-generation clan history of genetic markers that made him a marginally higher probability candidate for successful implantation. I did not know their faces. I was not required to know their faces. The morning continued. More aspirants, more litanies, more biometric lines on more slates. The numbers told stories that I was trained to read without sentiment, the way a navigator reads stellar charts. A deviation upward on the bone density index during osmodular integration suggested successful early uptake. A deviation downward in the cardiovascular trace during Biscopea insertion suggested potential secondary organ stress. Each reading connected to a protocol response, and each protocol response had been documented and approved and refined over decades of administrative practice. What I kept returning to, in the spaces between the litanies where my mind was not fully occupied, was the ledger. Not the compiled summary from the previous evening, with its 19.3%. The full ledger, the one I maintained myself. I was thinking about the sequence of events that led to a name being crossed out before death was confirmed. I was trying to construct a sequence of reasoning that resulted in that order of operations being correct, rather than premature, rather than careless, rather than something I did not have a clean word for. The reclamation queue had a fixed window. Once the apothecary indicated that an aspirant had been classified as non-viable for continued implantation, the reclamation team had a specific number of minutes in which to prepare for and conduct extraction procedures because implant viability degraded after death, and the window for successful recovery of certain gene seed organs was short. Speed was critical. The process demanded that classification precede death, not follow it, because by the time death was confirmed, the recovery window would have narrowed dangerously. This was the reasoning. It was sound reasoning. It served the preservation of the gene seed, which was the chapter's most irreplaceable resource. The classification system existed to protect that resource. The ledger marks I made were part of that protection. The straight lines I drew were, in the framework of this reasoning, acts of care. I carried this reasoning with me for the rest of the morning. It held together. It was architecturally sound. I had no quarrel with it at the level of procedure. I simply could not entirely stop seeing the name Corvus Thane beneath the straight line I had drawn through it, and the timestamp on the reclamation flag, and the timestamp on the death confirmation, and the 37 minutes between them. On the 19th day of the indoctrination phase, I was reassigned from the gene vaults to the hypno-chapels on the 3rd sublevel. The reassignment came through my slate terminal at the beginning of the morning watch. A one-line administrative transfer, signed by the senior apothecary's administrative adjutant, 2 levels above me in the divisional hierarchy. No explanation was given. Reassignment within the apothecarian's support structure was routine during a selection cycle, when the staffing requirements shifted with each phase. I gathered my recording equipment, my slate, my litany cards, and took the service corridor to the 3rd sublevel. The hypno-chapels were not surgical theatres. They were long, low-ceilinged chambers that might have resembled crypts had they not been lit by regular amber lumens mounted in recessed alcoves. The walls were carved from the mountain's native stone, which was black and smooth in the places where it had been worked and rough-textured where it had been left natural as a deliberate architectural contrast. The contrast served a purpose. The smooth surfaces carried sound cleanly, while the rough surfaces absorbed it, creating an auditory environment that dampened external noise while amplifying sounds generated within the chamber itself. This was intentional. Everything in the fortress monastery was intentional. The aspirants occupied the hypno-rigs. These were suspension frames of steel and padded restraint, positioned at regular intervals throughout the chamber, each angled so that the occupant faced the carved chapter sigil on the northern wall. The rigs held the aspirants in a semi-reclined position, neither fully supine nor fully upright, in a posture that the hypno-indoctrination texts described as maximally receptive. Nutrient tubes and hydration lines ran from each rig to the central dispensing column. The aspirants had been in the rigs for the past 19 days, removed only for periods of 3 hours in every 24 for supervised physical exercise and waste management. They were chanting when I entered. The sound was layered in a way that took a moment to resolve into its component parts. Each aspirant chanted the same phrase, a line from the chapter's primary catechism, on an individual breath cycle. Because they were not synchronized, the phrase repeated in a continuous, overlapping wave, so that at any given moment, several voices were beginning the phrase, several were in the middle of it, and several were finishing it, and the whole chamber breathed with it. the way a single enormous lung might breathe, in and out, and in again without pause. The phrase was this: "I am the instrument of the Emperor's will, and my will is the Emperor's. I am the instrument of the Emperor's will, and my will is the Emperor's." Over and over without inflection. The amber lumens through the stone walls in warm, alternating relief. My task was to record cognitive stabilization rates. The apothecarian tracked the progression of hypno-indoctrination by monitoring neural response patterns through sensor patches applied to each aspirant's temples. The data from these patches fed to a central terminal at the front of the chamber, which produced scrolling lines of cognitive amplitude data that I was trained to interpret. High amplitude variation indicated cognitive resistance, which was undesirable. Low amplitude variation indicated successful integration of the catechism content. The target was near uniform amplitude, which the charts described as integration saturation. I settled at the terminal and began reviewing the current morning's data. Most of the aspirants showed progress consistent with the 19th day projections in the indoctrination manual. A small number showed higher variation, which would trigger supplementary sessions. One aspirant, designated V89 in the administrative system, showed anomalous data. Amplitude readings that were not consistent with either resistance or integration, but with something the terminal's interpretation matrix flagged as indeterminate. I made a note and continued monitoring. The chanting did not stop. I want to describe what the chanting was like, because the description matters, and because I have thought about this particular morning more often than I have thought about the surgical theatres, which should perhaps suggest something about the differential nature of discomfort. The surgical theatres were dramatic in a physical sense. The hypno-chapels were something else. They were ordinary. There was no blood, no incisions, no fracturing bone. There were simply boys suspended in rigs, saying the same words, over and over, without inflection, for hours on end, in a chamber specifically designed to make those words fill the air completely. I had been trained in the purpose and mechanics of hypno-indoctrination, and I understood it as I understood the os modula, a sacred process, old and necessary, that did what it needed to do through means that required the recipient to endure rather than to choose. The doctrine of the adeptus astartes was not something that could be adopted voluntarily in the way a man might adopt a craft or a philosophy. It had to be instilled. The catechisms had to reach the level of the body, below the level of conscious thought, so that in combat they would function not as remembered principles, but as reflexes. This was the goal. The indoctrination manual was explicit about this. I had read the manual cover to cover during my first year in the apothecarian. I had found it comprehensible and rational, and rooted in 10 millennia of empirical refinement. I had found nothing in it that required me to feel anything in particular. The chanting continued. Approximately 2 hours into my monitoring session, aspirant V89 fell silent. I looked up from the terminal. The suspension rig held V89's body in its proper position. The nutrient lines were still running. The restraints were engaged. The silence from that position was not dramatic in the context of the layered chanting from the other rigs. One voice among 40 was not an absence you could easily locate without looking, but my task required me to monitor the terminal delta, and the terminal data for V89 had changed significantly, shifting from indeterminate readings to a flat line that the interpretation matrix flagged in amber. Cardiac failure. I looked at V89 in the rig. The body was still. The eyes were open. The position was identical to the position of every other aspirant in the chamber. The chaplain was at the far end of the chamber, moving between the rigs as he did periodically throughout the session, monitoring by eye and by the authority of his presence rather than by instrument. His skull helm cast no expression. He wore the full ceremonial vestments of his office, black and bone-trimmed, which were the same vestments he wore, whether or not the chamber contained any audience beyond the aspirants. I had been told by a more senior administrative staff member that the chaplains wore their full vestments because the armor itself was a form of instruction, a constant embodiment of the chapter's orthodoxy, and that the presence of the skull helm was meant to remind aspirants that they were always in the sight of death, and therefore always in the sight of the chapter's purpose. I called to him, at the appropriate volume for a staff address, Administrator 7-4 to Honored Chaplain. Aspirant 589 shows cardiac failure on the neural monitor. He turned toward me. He walked to V89's rig and examined the body without touching it. He spent perhaps 10 seconds in this examination. Then he turned toward the chamber. He ordered the rig left in position. He told me, in terms that were doctrinal rather than conversational, that the body would serve as a demonstration of endurance for the other aspirants, that they would learn as they continued their chanting in proximity to stillness, that the chapter's catechism persisted beyond the individual, that the presence of a silent rig was a form of instruction that no sermon could replicate. I returned to my terminal. The chanting continued, 40 voices minus 1, which meant the phrase still layered without interruption, still breathed in and out of the stone walls, still filled the amber-lit chamber completely. I looked at the terminal data. I recorded the time of failure for V89. I noted the chaplain's directive in the session log. What I did not note in the session log was the chaplain's reason for the directive. That portion of the record described the session as proceeding without significant interruption. I had not been instructed to omit it. I had simply, reviewing the available categories in the session log form, found no category that accommodated what had been ordered and had described the session in the terms that the form's categories allowed. This was the first time I erased a detail from an official record. I want to be precise about this because precision matters to the shape of what I am describing. I did not falsify anything. No entry was invented. No figure was altered. I simply described the session using the categories that existed, which did not include a category for a chaplain ordering a dead aspirant left upright as an educational exhibit. The form described the session as uninterrupted devotion, which was technically correct insofar as the chanting had not stopped and the indoctrination session had not been formally suspended. The form was accurate at the level of the categories it contained. The detail was gone. I had omitted it. I knew I had omitted it. I filed the session log and returned to my archive cell. The combat arenas occupied a series of interconnected chambers in the mountain's core, connected to the training corridors by descending stone ramps worn smooth by decades of boots. I was assigned to observe a structured combat evaluation 3 weeks after the Hypno-Chapel rotation. My function was to record neophyte performance metrics for the apothecarian's developmental files, which tracked the physical progress of aspirants who had survived implantation through the subsequent training phases. The arenas were carved from the mountain's interior, and the stone here was not the worked and smooth variety of the upper levels. It was rough, and black and ancient, and the ceilings above the largest arenas were high enough that the lumens mounted at their centers cast more shadow than light. The floor of the central arena had been stained by long use into a deep rust color that was not original to the stone, and the walls absorbed sound in an uneven way that made impacts echo in irregular patterns, so that a single blow in one quarter of the arena would arrive at the opposite wall as a different kind of sound, and the whole space was full of noise that did not correspond to any single source. The neophytes fighting in the central arena had been in post-implantation training for approximately 4 months. They were larger than they had been at intake, measurably and visibly. The Osmodula and Biscopia had done their work in the survivors. Their frames were denser, their movements already carrying something that was not yet the full articulation of space marine capability, but was no longer the movement of ordinary boys from ordinary worlds. They wore training vestments without armor. They carried practice blades. The evaluation was a structured duel format, 2 neophytes at a time. The objective was incapacitation of the opponent, which was operationally defined as either a submission acknowledgement or demonstrated inability to continue combat. The evaluation protocol specified that duels would continue until one neophyte could not or did not demonstrate combat readiness. Death was not a required outcome, but it was not excluded from the protocol either. I observed from a raised platform at the arena's western end, which gave me a clear sightline to the floor. The veteran sergeant who supervised the evaluation stood at the southern edge of the arena floor, watching. He was a full space marine, a brother of the chapter who had been assigned training duties for this cycle, and his presence in the arena compressed the space in the way that full Astartes always compressed spaces they occupied, not merely through size, but through the kind of authority that came from having survived everything the fortress monastery had done to aspirants like the ones now fighting below him. 2 neophytes fought. The first pair was unremarkable by the standards of what I was there to record. Both performed competently. The duel ended when one neophyte delivered a blow to the other's secondary heart, causing visible cardiovascular stress that collapsed the recipient to one knee. The recipient did not rise after a count of 10. The winning neophyte stepped back and stood at attention. I recorded the metrics. The second pair was also unremarkable. The third pair changed. The neophytes designated N14 and N23 entered the arena floor. Their intake files, which I had reviewed before the session, showed comparable biometric profiles. N14 had a slight edge in initial skeletal density measurements. N23 had shown stronger cardiovascular recovery rates following implantation stress. These were useful predictive metrics for combat performance, though not determinative. N14 established early dominance. N23 was slower to close distance, more reactive than proactive. Within 3 minutes of the duel's beginning, N23 had absorbed 3 significant blows, 2 to the torso and 1 to the left shoulder. The left shoulder blow had caused visible damage. N23 was fighting with a reduced range of motion on that side, compensating in a way that was competent but increasingly strained. N14 pressed the advantage. He set N23 dropped to one knee. The left arm was no longer functional. This was not a submission. N23 had not raised a hand or spoken the submission phrase. But the combat capacity was visibly compromised, and N14 had stopped advancing. Standing perhaps 2 paces away, practice blade lowered, The hesitation was perhaps 4 seconds. The veteran sergeant was moving before N14 had fully lowered the blade. He struck N14 from behind. A single blow to the base of the skull with the heel of his gauntlet, not at full Astartes strength, but at sufficient force to put N14 face first into the arena floor. N14 hit the stone hard and stayed there for a moment before pushing back to hands and knees, which was itself a demonstration of what 4 months of implantation had already done. The sergeant said nothing for a moment. The arena was very quiet. I was writing on my slate. The scrape of my stylus was audible. He told N14 that delay was impurity. He said this once, calmly, the way one states a fact of mathematics. He said that the duel had ended when N23 dropped. He said that the moment of incapacitation was the moment to act, not the moment to hesitate, and that the 4 seconds N14 had spent with the blade lowered were 4 seconds in which N14 had chosen something over the mission, and the chapter had no use for that choice. He said this was not cruelty. He said this was curriculum. Then he looked at N23. N23 was still on one knee, breathing hard, the left arm hanging. The sergeant struck N23 across the face with the back of his gauntlet. Not hard enough to damage the skull. Hard enough to be a statement. He said that N23 would return to recovery and report to the apothecarian for assessment. He said that if the shoulder did not heal to full function within the specified recovery window, N23 would be reclassified. N23 said nothing. N23 stood, which took effort, and left the arena. N14 had gotten back to both feet by this point and was standing at attention. I recorded N14 response, delayed close following opponent incapacitation, corrective discipline administered within chapter training parameters, N23 injury noted, post-assessment required. I did not record what the corrective discipline had been. The category in the performance metrics form was labeled corrective intervention, which I interpreted as encompassing what I had witnessed. The category was accurate in the sense that the form's categories were accurate. It did not specify method. I was aware, walking back up the ramps to the administrative wing, that I had now omitted a detail from an official record for the second time. The smell in the subterranean arena stayed with me longer than I expected it to. The dominant note was a combination of copper and promethium, the first from the rust-stained floor and the metabolic byproducts of physical exertion, the second from the torches mounted in wall brackets throughout the chamber. It was not unpleasant exactly. It was simply a smell that carried information, the way the counterseptic smell of the surgical theatres carried information. And the information it carried was specific and irreversible. I understood that mercy had no architecture here. I did not mean this as a metaphor. I meant it in the literal sense that the space had been designed to conduct what it conducted, without remainder or exception. The walls that absorbed sound unevenly were the same walls that absorbed blood. The stone floor that had been stained over decades had been stained because the process required that it be stained, and no one had cleaned it to original condition, because original condition was not the point. The training arena was a machine for making something. The making required this. The architecture confirmed the requirement. I returned to my cell and filed the performance metrics. My records were accurate at the level of the categories available to me. I told myself this several times before going to sleep, which was not a practice I had engaged in before the third selection cycle. The organ reclamation chamber was on the second sub-level, adjacent to the gene vaults, connected to them by a short corridor whose walls were lined with preservation canisters in sealed alcoves. I had passed this corridor many times in my years in the Apothecarian without being assigned to work within the reclamation chamber itself. My previous cycles had not required it. The third selection cycle did, because the attrition rates in the second implantation phase had produced a volume of reclamation work that exceeded the current staffing capacity of the Apothecarian's reclamation team, and I had been assigned to assist with documentation. The assignment notice arrived on my slate terminal on a morning when the air in the administrative wing felt particularly recycled, as though the ventilation had been running at reduced capacity. I gathered my recording equipment and went to the second sub-level. The reclamation chamber was warm. This was the first thing I noticed. The gene vaults were cold, precisely temperature controlled, because cold slowed biological degradation, and the gene vaults contained material that required preservation. The reclamation chamber was warm because the machinery that operated within it generated heat, and because heat was, in this context, part of the process rather than a problem to be managed. There were 2 incinerators along the eastern wall, both running. Their presence raised the ambient temperature of the chamber by what I estimated at 12 degrees above the rest of the sub-level. The reclamation saws were on a central workbench. They were smaller than the surgical instruments in the gene vaults, more specialized. The vibration they produced was transmitted through the bench's legs to the chamber floor, and from there to the soles of my boots. A faint and continuous tremor that was not unpleasant, but was unmistakably present. The presiding apothecary for this assignment was not the same one from Theatre 7. He was older, more senior, with the kind of focused quiet about him that indicated someone who had been performing the same tasks for a long time and had organized his relationship with those tasks into something stable and functional. My function was documentation. I would record implant viability assessments as the apothecary made them and stamp each recovered organ with its classification. The forms were standard apothecarian documentation: organ type, recovery date, viability grade, storage designation. 3 failed aspirants were brought to the reclamation chamber during my assigned session. The first 2 presented no complications. Both had been confirmed dead prior to the apothecary's preliminary examination. Confirmation of death was a step in the protocol, required before reclamation procedures began, and in these 2 cases, the step was met cleanly. The apothecary worked with the competent efficiency I had come to understand as the apothecarian's signature. I recorded. I stamped. The incinerators received material. The process was orderly. The third aspirant was brought in at approximately mid-session. The apothecary began his preliminary examination. I was standing to the side of the workbench with my slate, reviewing the previous session's entries for accuracy. I was not looking directly at the aspirant on the bench when the apothecary made a short, controlled sound and stopped his preliminary examination. I looked up. The aspirant's right hand had moved. The sedation administered during reclamation preparation had been calculated for a specific body mass at a specific metabolic rate. Something had been miscalculated, or the aspirant's recent implantation had altered metabolic rate in a way that was not fully reflected in the pre-procedure assessment. The aspirant was not conscious in the way that words and expressions would have suggested. But there was movement. The right hand had opened from a fist to a partial extension of the fingers. And as I watched, The head turned minimally to one side. The apothecary assessed the situation for approximately 5 seconds. He continued. He did not alter the procedure. He did not call for additional sedation, though I had seen additional sedation administered in other contexts when unexpected patient response had occurred. He adjusted his angle of approach and continued the reclamation work. His hands were steady. His instruments were precise. The tremor from the saws continued through the floor and through my boots. I stood at the side of the workbench, and I held my slate. The aspirant's eyes opened. They did not focus. There was no indication that what was happening was being perceived or processed at the level of consciousness that produces response. But the eyes were open. The irises were light. A grey-brown colour that was common in the Highland clans of Vereth 4. The overhead lumens reflected in them. I looked at the viability data on my slate. The implanted osmodular segment showed high viability, 84% recovery probability, which was an excellent result, which was exactly the kind of result that justified the efficiency of the process, that justified the window calculations and the reclamation queue, and the straight lines in the ledger. 84%. The gene seed would live. It would go into the preservation canisters in the corridor alcoves, and eventually into another aspirant, and eventually into a space marine who would fight for the Imperium in the Emperor's name. The grey-brown eyes were still open. I stamped the viability form. I wrote 84 on the viability grade line. I stamped the storage designation. I held the stylus in my hand, and I did not drop it, and I did not make a sound, and my records were accurate. My hands were cold despite the warmth of the reclamation chamber. When the session ended, and I returned to the administrative wing, and sat at my archive cell's writing surface, I noticed that I had been pressing my stylus into the surface harder than usual during the documentation. There were faint marks in the surface's material that had not been there before. I placed my palms flat on the writing surface and held them there for a while. I confirmed viability stamps on reclaimed organs while an aspirant's eyes were open. That was what I had done. The stamping was accurate. The viability assessment was accurate. The documentation was complete and correct. I had crossed a threshold somewhere between witness and accomplice, and I had not announced it, and no ceremony had marked it, and the ledger showed nothing but correct entries. It was approximately 2 weeks after the reclamation chamber assignment that the senior librarian summoned me to the archival vaults. I should clarify that the summons did not arrive as a threat. It arrived as an administrative request, formatted in the standard interdivisional communication template, routed through the standard Vox relay. The librarian wished to review the documentation produced by the apothecarian's administrative staff during the 3rd selection cycle's ongoing phases. This was described as a routine linguistic audit, which was a category of review that I had not previously encountered, but which the summons indicated was a standard practice conducted periodically to ensure that official documentation met the chapter's standards of doctrinal phrasing. I gathered my complete documentation archive for the cycle and reported to the archival vaults. The archival vaults were on the 6th administrative level, higher in the mountain than my cell. They were lit by cold white lumens rather than the amber of the lower levels, which gave the space a clinical quality that the surgical theatres also had. The librarian was already present when I arrived. He was not in full battle armour. He wore the administrative vestments of his office, which were less dramatically imposing than the skull helms and ceramite of the ceremonial spaces, but no less authoritative in the context of a review. He told me to take a seat. He reviewed my documentation in silence for some time. I sat across from him and kept my hands on the table and did not speak. The only sound was the cold white lumens, which had a faint electrical note, and the turning of data slate pages. He looked up. He said that my documentation was thorough. He said that my biometric records were accurate and well maintained. He said that my procedural logging was consistent with apothecarian standards. He said that my choice of descriptive language had shown variance from established doctrinal terminology in 11 separate instances across the current cycle's documentation. I said that I was not aware of any departures from approved terminology. He showed me the instances. 7 of them I had not noticed myself making. In 2 cases, I had used the word unnecessary in a context where standard terminology would have been supplementary or additional. In 1 case, I had used the word prolonged where standard terminology would have been extended. In 3 cases, I had used the word excessive in contexts where standard terminology would have been optimal or enhanced. The remaining 4 were more deliberate, though I had not fully consciously registered them as deliberate. In 1 session log entry, I had described an evaluation outcome as resulting in elevated attrition, where standard terminology would have been achieving selection efficiency. In another, I had described a reclamation session's duration as extending beyond estimated parameters, where standard terminology would have been fulfilling adjusted reclamation requirements. The librarian indicated these with a precision that told me he had reviewed the documentation carefully and had likely reviewed it more than once. He told me that linguistic variance in official documentation was not a trivial matter. He told me that the chapter's records were not merely administrative documents. They were, in aggregate, a form of scripture. The language used to describe the chapter's processes was doctrinal language, refined over centuries to reflect accurate theological understanding of what those processes were and why they existed. When a record described attrition as elevated, where doctrine would describe it as selective, the record was not merely imprecise. It was introducing a perspective into the official record that did not align with the chapter's understanding of its own work. He was not angry. He was precise. He was explaining a problem in the way that problems are explained when the problem is real, and the explanation is genuine. I told him that I understood. I told him that I would review the documentation and correct the phrasing. Then I told him that the variance had been unintentional. He looked at me for a moment. He said that unintentional variance was noted. He said that the review would close without formal notation of dissent, as the pattern was not yet sufficient to warrant the full corrective process. He said that the documentation would be corrected and that future records would be expected to conform to standard terminology. He said, "You are performing your function well. Ensure the function remains the function." I returned to my archive cell. The archival vaults had been cold, colder than my cell, and the cold had penetrated my clothing during the review. I sat at my writing surface, and I was still cold. I reviewed the 11 instances he had identified. Looking at them now, with the distance of the review, I could see each one clearly. I could see the moment at which I had written unnecessary rather than supplementary, and I could see why I had written it. And I could see that the why was not ambiguous if you examined it closely. The why was that the thing I was describing had felt unnecessary in a way that supplementary did not capture. That feeling was now a matter of record. Or rather, it had been a matter of record, and was now going to be corrected from the record. I began editing. Standard terminology. Optimal. Enhanced. Selection efficiency. Adjusted reclamation requirements. I went through each of the 11 instances and replaced my language with the approved terminology. Each replacement was correct. Each replacement was also a compression. The replacement did not make the entry false. It made the entry conform to the framework within which the entry existed. When I finished, the entries were accurate. I sat in my cold archive cell and understood that I had begun editing myself before writing. Internal language had become monitored space. The 11 instances were not the only places where my perspective had pressed against the available categories. They were simply the places where the pressure had produced visible variance. Every entry I produced from this point forward would be produced by a person who knew that variance was observed and noted. Agency narrows. That was not a phrase from any doctrinal text I had read. It was simply the accurate description of what had happened. The black carapace implantation deadline approached with the inflexibility of a scheduled event, which was precisely what it was, as the campaign departure date was fixed by factors above the Fortress Monastery's authority, above the chapter master's authority, above even the strategic concerns of the segmentum command to which the chapter reported. The Crusade fleet required its component forces by a specific date. The chapter had made commitments that could not be renegotiated. The neophytes who would accompany the Battle Brothers as part of the campaign's training complement needed to have completed their black carapace implantation before departure. This created a fixed window within which the final implantation phase had to be completed. I learned about the deadline's pressure, not from any single announcement, but from the accumulating evidence of operational decisions in the weeks following my meeting with the senior librarian. Recovery intervals shortened. Aspirants who had been given standard post-implantation monitoring periods of 72 hours were now being evaluated for advancement at 48. The surgical schedules expanded. The apothecaries worked additional watch periods. The chronometers in the surgical theatres were suddenly more prominent in the sensory landscape of the gene vault. Their mechanical ticking, a persistent presence that had always been there, but had not previously registered so specifically. I was reviewing aspirant readiness assessments for the black carapace phase when I noticed that the approved recovery threshold for preomnar and homophagia integration had been revised downward. The revision was documented in an administrative amendment to the apothecarian's procedural standards, dated 4 days prior, and signed by the senior apothecary. The amendment was framed as a refinement based on current cohort data, which indicated that the aspirants from the Verath 4 tithe showed faster adaptation rates than historical averages from other tithe worlds, and that the standard recovery interval could therefore be reduced without compromising implantation success rates. I reviewed the data that was cited in support of this conclusion. The data was real. The adaptation rates for the surviving aspirants from this cohort were, in fact, marginally higher than the historical averages the amendment referenced. The marginal difference was approximately 4%. The recovery interval reduction was 18 hours. I am not an apothecary. I am a gene scribe adjutant with administrative training. I was not qualified to assess whether a 4% improvement in adaptation rate justified an 18-hour reduction in recovery interval. What I could assess was the timing of the amendment. The amendment had been produced and approved 4 days after the campaign departure date had been formally communicated to the Fortress Monastery through official chapter channels. The correlation was precise. I filed the amendment in the Procedural Standards Archive. I updated the affected aspirant readiness assessment forms to reflect the new thresholds. I approved shortened stabilization protocols, as required by the amended standards. The mortality rate in the subsequent 2 weeks increased, not dramatically, not in a way that would appear as crisis in the compiled summaries, as the increase was absorbed by the existing variance margins in the cycle documentation, producing numbers that were elevated, but not outside the adjusted thresholds that the amendment had effectively created. The compiled summaries, when I reviewed them, showed numbers that looked like a challenging but manageable phase of a difficult selection cycle. I had approved the shortened protocols, knowing they would raise mortality. I had not made this statement explicitly to myself at the time of approving them. I had approved them because the amendment required my administrative approval as part of the documentation chain, and the amendment had been signed by the senior apothecary, and declining to approve a properly authorized amendment from a superior within my divisional chain would have required a formal process of administrative objection that was itself documented and reviewed, and that would have produced a notation in my record. I approved the protocols. Time had dictated the decision. The decision had been made above me and before me. I had simply been the link in the chain that confirmed the decision was correctly transmitted to the relevant documentation. This was accurate. I believed it was accurate. I sat in my archive cell after approving the protocols, and I listened to the ventilation system work, and I did not add anything to the official record, and I did not subtract anything from the official record, and the records were correct. After the minor notational deviations had been corrected following the librarian's review, I was relocated from my archive cell in the main administrative wing to a smaller cell in the secondary archival section, which was a corridor branching from the main administrative level that contained overflow storage, older data slate archives, and a series of cells that had originally been intended for more senior personnel, but had been repurposed over the decades as the administrative structure reorganized. My new cell was slightly smaller than my previous one. The ventilation was the same quality. The luminary had only one level of brightness rather than two. The official reason given for the relocation was space reallocation within the administrative wing, which was plausible. The administrative wing had been at capacity for most of the selection cycle, with additional support staff assigned for the high activity phases. Relocating less senior personnel to secondary sections was a standard response. I had no grounds to object. I accepted the relocation, transferred my few personal effects to the shelf in the new cell, and updated my terminal access address in the Vox relay system. What changed was interaction density. In the main administrative wing, I had regular incidental contact with other apothecarian staff, brief exchanges in the corridor, shared use of the data slate terminals in the common archive room, the kind of ordinary operational adjacency that constituted most of the social environment in the Fortress Monastery's administrative tier. In the secondary archival section, the only regular presence was a more senior archivist who occupied the cell at the corridor's far end, and whose work required minimal coordination with my own. We passed each other occasionally. We exchanged administrative courtesies. Mostly I was alone with the recycled air and the parchment smell and the distant percussion of combat drills, which was audible even at this depth in the mountain as a faint vibration through the stone. Alone, reflection filled the space that interaction had previously occupied. This was not a comfortable development. I had not previously understood how much external reinforcement the ordinary administrative routine provided against the specific kind of thinking that silence permitted. When I was recording procedures and attending rituals, and consulting with colleagues and submitting forms and receiving instructions, the content of my consciousness was largely occupied by those activities. The activities were constant enough that the spaces between them were small. In the secondary archival section, the spaces were larger. I began maintaining two mental ledgers. The official ledger continued as it had, precise, doctrinal, conforming to the approved terminology that the librarian's review had confirmed was required. I had no additional notation deviations following the review. I was careful. I understood what the categories were, and I populated them correctly. The unofficial ledger was not written. It existed in the spaces between the official entries, in the gaps of the forms where the categories ran out. It contained the things I knew that the forms did not have categories for, the 37 minutes between the ledger mark and the death confirmation for Corvus Thane. The dead aspirant, upright in the hypno-rig, the grey-brown eyes in the reclamation chamber, the 4 seconds of N14's hesitation, the 18-hour reduction in recovery interval. The word unnecessary replaced 11 times with optimal. The division between the two ledgers was clear. It could not be undone, any more than any of the other irreversibilities of the cycle could be undone. What I had participated in could not be unparticipated in. What I had recorded could not be unrecorded. What I had omitted could not be unomitted. The ledger was what it was. The other ledger was what it was. I lay on my cot in the secondary archival section and listened to the ventilation system and the distant percussion of the training levels, and I understood that I had been split in two, and that both halves were real, and that only one of them was permitted to speak. The oath of reaffirmation was a standard practice conducted before the final implantation phase of a selection cycle, in which all assigned apothecarian staff and associated personnel confirmed their commitment to the chapter's processes and their understanding that the work they performed was sacred duty. I had taken the oath at the beginning of my first selection cycle, and the oath was renewed at the commencement of each subsequent cycle. I had not previously experienced the renewal as anything other than a procedural formality, necessary and correct, but unremarkable. The third selection cycle's renewal was conducted in the Chapel of the Sacred Instruments, a mid-level ceremonial space adjacent to the apothecarian's primary wing. The chapel was a long, narrow room with a vaulted ceiling carved from the mountain stone, lit by braziers set into alcoves along both walls. The stone absorbed the brazier light differently than it absorbed the amber lumens of the hypno-chapels, or the cold white of the archival vaults, casting the walls in alternating warm orange and deep shadow that moved as the flames moved. The chaplain who had ordered the dead aspirant, left upright in the hypno-rig, was present. He did not address me specifically. He addressed the assembled staff collectively. He spoke about the nature of duty as the chapter understood it. That duty was not merely obligation, but transformation. That the act of performing sacred work changed the performer in ways proportionate to the work's sanctity. That what we did in the gene vaults and the surgical theatres and the training arenas was not merely organizational function, but participation in the Emperor's design. He said that uncertainty was human, and therefore something to be moved past rather than indulged. He said that the oath was not a statement of what we believed, but a statement of what we chose, and that choice made in service to the chapter. was the highest exercise of human agency. The staff around me were still and attentive. I was still and attentive. We knelt. The stone floor was cold. The brazier heat was at shoulder height and above, leaving the floor cold and the air above warm. This differential was familiar from other ceremonial observances in the fortress monastery. The cold floor was always the floor. The warmth was always above. We recited the oath. I affirm that my function serves the Emperor's sacred design. I affirm that the suffering enacted in the service of the chapter's gene seed is holy and necessary, and not to be questioned. I affirm that I will perform my duties without hesitation, without deviation, without the intrusion of sentiment that belongs to ordinary human life and not to the work of the apothecarian. I affirm that the yield of each selection cycle is a gift to the chapter, and through the chapter to the Imperium, and through the Imperium to the Emperor, and that I am honored to serve its production. My voice joined the other voices. The chapel returned the sound in a different way than the hypno chapels had. A single clear resonance rather than layered overlap. All voices synchronized to the same phrase at the same time. The chaplain raised his crozius and blessed the staff. We rose from the cold floor. I was recorded as having taken the oath. The recording was a standard administrative confirmation. Name, date, position, cycle number. Signed by the chaplain as witness. Filed in the apothecarian's personnel archive. I had sworn to uphold the process without hesitation. My voice was on the record. I walked back to the secondary archival section. The warmth of the braziers faded as I descended. The cold of the lower levels was consistent and impersonal. My oath was accurate in one sense, and not in another, and both of those things were simultaneously true in a way that I had not previously had to manage, and that I was now beginning to understand was simply the condition I would occupy for however long the cycle continued. The vow was both shield and shackle. I had identified both qualities at the moment of recitation, and had recited it anyway, and it was now in the archive. Future dissent would be dissent against my own voice. The centuries of archive data occupied the deep archival vaults on the 7th administrative level, accessible through a narrow service stair from the secondary section where my cell was located. I had been assigned review access as part of my documentation responsibilities for the 3rd selection cycle, because certain period comparisons required historical baselines that the current cycle's records alone could not provide. I had been accessing these archives regularly for months, but the review I conducted 3 weeks before the Black Carapace deadline was different from previous archival work, because this time I was not looking for specific baseline figures. I was looking at the shape of the data across time. The archived selection cycle records went back far enough that I could construct mortality curves for a span of centuries. The archives were not complete. Some earlier periods were represented by summaries rather than full records, and some records had been damaged by the accumulated stresses of the mountain environment. But what remained was sufficient. I had enough data points. I had been maintaining data for 3 cycles now, and had developed enough facility with the apothecarian's documentation systems to build a meaningful comparative analysis. I spent an entire watch period in the cold, deep archival vaults. Parchment and data slates spread across a reading surface. The cold white lamps overhead steady. The mortality curve did not vary. Across the centuries of documented selection cycles, the attrition rate during the implantation phases maintained a specific range, not a precise number, because biological processes did not permit precision at that level, but a range with a center and with variance on both sides of the center that stayed within consistent bounds. The center of the range was approximately the same figure, regardless of which century I was examining. The variance boundaries were approximately the same. This was not in itself remarkable. Consistent mortality rates across consistent processes could simply indicate that the processes were well developed and stable. What was remarkable was what happened when aspirant quality changed. I found 3 periods in the archive where the incoming aspirant cohorts had shown significantly elevated biometric profiles, either from exceptionally productive tithe periods on Verath 4, or from supplementary recruitment from secondary worlds during high-demand campaigns. In each of these 3 periods, the aspirant cohort was measurably better. Higher bone density, stronger initial cardiovascular profiles, better hypno-indoctrination response scores. In each of these 3 periods, the mortality rate in the implantation phases was the same as in every other period. The center of the range did not move upward to reflect improved aspirant quality. The variance around the center did not narrow to reflect reduced risk. The mortality curve was the same. I looked at the process adjustments documented alongside these periods. In the first period, an increase in environmental hazard severity in the training arenas during the post-implantation phase. In the second period, an acceleration of surgical timelines during the implantation phase itself, which the documentation described as a response to operational urgency, but which I could see, in the light of what the data showed, had occurred during a period of no particular urgency. In the third period, there's an upward revision of the standards for acceptable biometric deviation during the rites themselves, raising the threshold for what constituted a viable implantation outcome, which had the effect of classifying more aspirants as non-viable without changing the surgery. In each case, the adjustment had compensated for the improved aspirant quality by introducing additional pressure that maintained the mortality at its historical center. I sat in the cold archival vault and looked at the numbers. The curve was not constant because the aspirants were always the same quality. The curve was constant because something in the system adjusted to keep it constant. The adjustments were not coordinated in the sense of a deliberate conspiracy, and they arose from individual operational decisions made by individual senior apothecaries responding to immediate considerations. But the aggregate effect was invariant. The suffering was not accidental. The loss was not unfortunate. It was calibrated. This was not a malfunction of the system. This was not corruption or neglect or cruelty in the ordinary sense. The system was operating as intended, producing the curve it had always produced, making the choices that maintained the curve. The horror was not that something had gone wrong. The horror was that everything was functioning perfectly. I had believed that mortality was the side effect of a process aimed at producing the strongest possible warriors. I had believed that the deaths were regrettable, but acceptable costs of the sacred work. I had believed that the calibration of the process was oriented toward minimizing loss while maintaining quality. The data did not support this. The data suggested that the calibration of the process was oriented toward maintaining loss at a consistent level, regardless of other factors. The loss was not a side effect. The loss was a feature. It was maintained. It was, in the most literal sense of the word, preserved. I thought about the chaplain's sermon in the Hypno Chapel, which I had transcribed from audio records some weeks prior, and which had used language I had found notable at the time, without fully understanding why. The chaplain had spoken of the forging. He had used the word story specifically. The story of the forging. He had said that the chapter's neophytes were not merely made through the rite, but were made by the truth of the rite's cost. I understood now what that language described. The Imperium did not only need space marines, it needed the story of what it cost to make them. Warriors who had never almost died, who had moved through training in high survival rates, who had not been measured against a mortality curve that remained constant across centuries, would be different kinds of warriors than what the chapter actually produced. Not necessarily weaker in physical terms, different in a specific way that I was beginning to understand the chaplain's sermon had been attempting to articulate. The aspirants who survived were survivors of a process calibrated to require survival. They had not merely endured the implantation, they had endured a specifically maintained level of loss. They had trained alongside dead brothers. They had been measured by a standard that killed a consistent proportion of every cohort. They had been shaped not only by the gene seed in their bodies, but by the knowledge, below the level of conscious articulation, that the process they were part of had claimed others who were not weaker than them in any measurable sense. Space Marine training was not designed to produce the strongest possible warriors. It was designed to produce warriors who had already died in every way that mattered. I filed the archival review in the standard documentation system, noting that I had conducted a historical baseline analysis for variance comparison. I did not note what I had found. The categories available did not include a category for what I had found. I returned to my cell. The ventilation was running normally. The single brightness luminary cast the cell in consistent light. My personal effects were on the shelf in the same positions I had placed them. Everything was as it had been. Nothing was as it had been. I began, in the days following the archival review, to read the archived sermons differently. This was not a deliberate project. It arose from the fact that sermon transcription had become part of my assigned duties during the cycle, and that I had therefore accumulated a significant archive of transcribed material, some of which I had produced myself, and some of which I was reviewing as part of the cycle's ongoing documentation work. The sermons were rich material for the librarian's kind of linguistic analysis, because the chaplains operated with a highly developed vocabulary, and because the theological content of their addresses was sufficiently dense that review was required to ensure accurate transcription. I reviewed a sermon transcribed during the 4th week of the hypno-indoctrination phase. The chaplain addressing the neophytes had spoken extensively about the relationship between the aspirants' prior life and the life they were becoming. He had framed this in terms of weight, the weight of childhood, the weight of family memory, the weight of personal attachment as accumulated impediment to the purity of service. He had said that the chapter's neophytes were not asked to choose between their previous identity and their new one. He had said they were being given the opportunity to discover that their previous identity had never been real in the first place. I had transcribed this accurately. Looking at it now, I heard it differently. The sermon had produced a specific effect on several neophytes in attendance. I had record of this because the effect had been noted in the post-session behavioral assessment. 3 neophytes had requested voluntary neural scrubbing to eliminate familial recollection, and their requests had been approved. The requests had been processed and implemented within 48 hours. The behavioral assessment had noted this as an encouraging demonstration of the indoctrination's progress. I thought about what it meant that the requests had been voluntary. The neophytes had not been instructed to request scrubbing, and they had not been told that familial recollection was something they needed to formally request removal of. They had listened to a sermon about the weight of prior identity, and had, on their own initiative, chosen to remove evidence of that weight from themselves. They had wanted to become what the process was making them. This was described in the behavioral assessment as encouraging progress. I thought about my own identity formation. I had been 14 when the recruiting sergeant had assessed me and found me too tall for implantation candidacy and suitable for administrative service. I had accepted this without difficulty. I had adapted to the fortress monastery's environment without, as far as I was aware, experiencing significant resistance. I had internalized the arithmetic of sacrifice as sacred design, and had believed it, and had performed my function competently. I thought about whether the system that had shaped the neophytes was different in kind from the system that had shaped me, or only different in degree and method. I did not pursue this thought to a conclusion. I filed the sermon transcription in the archive and moved to the next document. The sealed directive arrived via the standard secure documentation channel on a morning approximately 2 weeks before the Black Carapace deadline. Its classification level was one above my standard access, but I had been granted temporary elevated access for the historical baseline review, and this access had not yet been revoked. The directive arrived in my incoming queue, and I opened it without initially recognizing its classification as unusual. It was a procurement document. Specifically, it was a multi-cycle yield projection prepared for the apothecarian's campaign readiness assessment, which calculated the expected number of fully implanted neophytes available for deployment across the next 3 campaign cycles, based on current cohort entry rates, historical mortality curves, and projected tithe volumes. The document was several pages long. It was written in the standard administrative language of the apothecarian, precise and category specific. I read it 3 times. The yield projections were built on the mortality curves as fixed constants. The document did not treat mortality as a variable to be minimized or as a challenge to be managed. It treated the mortality curve as a stable input, as reliable as the tithe volume data or the implantation procedure timelines. The projection tables allocated expected losses by phase. The allocation was used to calculate net surviving neophytes per cycle. The net surviving neophytes per cycle were the yield figure used in the procurement assessment for campaign readiness. The mortality was budgeted. It was a line item in the calculation, the same way tithe volume was a line item, the same way surgical procedure duration was a line item. It was a known quantity, a predicted input, a factor in the formula. The document did not treat it as a tragedy or a cost or even a problem. It was simply one of the constants in the procurement equation. I thought about the word procurement. Procurement was the acquisition of resources. The procurement assessment was calculating the acquisition rate of Space Marines from the production process of the selection cycle. The neophytes who survived the process were the acquired resource. The neophytes who did not survive were part of the production cost. The mortality was not a failure of the process. It was the process's operating cost, as stable and predictable as any other operating cost, built into the projections with the same confidence that one builds in fuel consumption rates or maintenance intervals. The Imperium required consistent narrative of forging. The document was stamped with approval sigils from several senior administrative levels. It was a routine document of the kind produced at multiple points in every campaign cycle. It had been in the archive, presumably, for a very long time, as produced and approved and filed and superseded by the next edition without particular remark. It was simply how the procurement of Space Marines was calculated. Obedience was not corrupted. Obedience was functioning. I filed the directive in the secure archive. I updated my access log to reflect the retrieval. I did not note the document's content in any other record. I sat at my writing surface in the secondary archival section, and I felt the particular quality of clarity that comes not from understanding something new, but from understanding that something you already knew was true, had been true all along, and that all previous framings of it as not quite true had been the self-protective function of a mind that was not ready to hold the full weight of it. The system was not malfunctioning. The system was not corrupt. The system was not operating differently than intended. It was intended. Every horror I had witnessed, every administrative decision that had required me to compress my language and expand my compliance, every straight line I had drawn through a name, every viability stamp I had confirmed, every shortened protocol I had approved, every form I had completed in categories that did not accommodate what I had actually seen. All of it was the correct operation of a system functioning as designed. I had been operating correctly. The numbers had always been calibrated to produce this. I did not sleep well that night. I want to include this detail because it is the kind of detail that the official records do not contain, and that the unofficial ledger, the one that existed only in the spaces between official entries, and recorded with perfect fidelity. I lay on my cot, and the ventilation ran, and the distant percussion of the training levels was inaudible at this hour, and the single brightness luminary was off, and I did not sleep. I thought about the grey-brown eyes in the reclamation chamber. I thought about Corvus Thane's name beneath the straight line. I thought about whether there was a version of this in which what I had witnessed and participated in was something other than what the procurement document described it as, and I could not construct that version from the materials available. What I had been doing was what the system required. What the system required was what it had always required. The neophytes who volunteered to have their childhood memories scrubbed had done so correctly. The system had made them want to become what the system required. I had been made to want to serve the system. The difference between their formation and mine was the method used and the category of service assigned, and possibly nothing else. I got up before the morning watch and went to my writing surface and reviewed my documentation for the cycle from the beginning. The review was orderly. The records were accurate. The language conformed to approved terminology throughout, corrected following the librarian's review. The biometric records were complete and precise. The viability assessments were correctly stamped. The session logs were thorough. The records were the best records I had produced in 3 selection cycles. They contained nothing that was not supposed to be in them. I closed the archive and prepared for the morning's assignments. The librarian summoned me again on a morning when the air in the secondary archival section tasted of dust and recycled parchment, approximately 1 week before the black carapace deadline. The summons was formatted as an administrative consultation rather than an audit review, which was a different category of summons and carried different implications. An audit review was a retrospective assessment of completed documentation. A consultation was a prospective discussion. I reported to the archival vaults. He was seated when I arrived. He gestured to the chair across from him, which I occupied. He had a data slate in his hands, which he set on the table between us, rather than reviewing it while speaking. This was a practiced choice, as I understood it as a signal that the conversation was direct rather than documentary. He told me that the apothecarian's senior staff had conducted a review of support personnel following the mid-cycle operational adjustments. He said that the review had included assessment of personnel disposition and its potential effects on operational function. He said that this was a standard practice conducted in extended selection cycles to ensure that administrative staff were maintaining the psychological calibration necessary for their roles. He said that my file had been noted in the review. He said this without particular emphasis, the way one might note that a form had been returned with a question mark in one of the fields. He said that prolonged exposure to aspirant mortality during implantation cycles was a known occupational factor in apothecarian administrative roles. He said that the apothecarian had developed responses to this factor based on experience over many cycles. He said that the responses were designed to ensure that administrative staff could continue to function effectively in their roles without the kind of cumulative empathic residue that would compromise record accuracy. Empathic residue. He used that phrase precisely. He offered me two options. The first was neural dampening, a procedure conducted by the chapter's tech adepts in the Medicae facilities on the upper administrative level. It was described as a selective attenuation of certain emotional processing pathways, targeted specifically at the pathways most associated with the type of residue he had identified. The procedure was reversible in theory, but was documented as rarely reversed in practice. Following the procedure, I would be eligible for elevation to full apothecarian service as a confirmed gene scribe, a step up from my current adjutant status that would involve expanded responsibilities and formally acknowledged expertise. The second option was neural scrubbing with redeployment as chapter serf. This was described as a more comprehensive procedure that would address the residue by eliminating the specific episodic memories in which it was embedded. The serf redeployment would be to an appropriate administrative function, commensurate with retained skills, with the episodic gaps filled by standard serf conditioning. It was presented as a genuine alternative rather than a punishment. He told me that I had time to consider the options. I told him that I was ready to provide an answer. He looked at me for a moment. The archival vault was cold and white-lit and quiet. I told him I would accept the neural dampening and elevation to full gene scribe status. He made a note on his data slate. He told me that the procedure would be scheduled within the next 48 hours. He told me that the decision was noted with approval and that my service during the current cycle had been, on balance, exemplary. He said the word balance with the slight additional weight of a word doing more than one kind of work. I returned to the secondary archival section. I sat at my writing surface. I want to describe what I felt in the interval between leaving the archival vault and the moment I sat down, because the description is important and because after the procedure, I will not have access to this description with the same fidelity. What I felt was not the dramatic internal crisis of a person choosing between integrity and compliance. I had already made most of the choices. The ledger existed as it existed. The records were as they were. The straight lines were drawn. The viability stamps were confirmed. The shortened protocols were approved. The oath was on the record. None of these would change regardless of which option I had chosen. What I felt was the specific quality of a door closing. Not dramatically, not with violence. The way a door closes in a well-maintained building. Smoothly, on calibrated hinges, with a small, clean sound at the end of the motion, and then silence. The choice had not been between two meaningfully different futures. The choice had been between a future in which I retained the memory of what I had witnessed and continued the work, and a future in which I retained a managed version of the memory and continued the work. The work continued in both cases. The work had always been going to continue. I was not declining to participate. I was agreeing to participate with less friction. The procedure was scheduled for 2 days hence. I filed the confirmation in the personnel records. I resumed my assigned documentation for the third selection cycle's final phase. The evening before the procedure, I was assigned to assist with documentation for the final black carapace implantation preparations. The black carapace was the last major implantation in the Astartes creation process. The neural interface that would allow a space marine to fully integrate with and be integrated by his power armor. It was the implantation that, more than any other, marked the boundary between what an aspirant had been and what they would become. The surgical theatres on the lower levels had been prepared for the final batch of aspirants from the third selection cycle. I was assigned to Theatre 3 for this session, a different theatre than my original assignment. I stood at the lectern of bone and brass. I looked at the aspirants being brought to the slabs. There were 3 of them. 3 aspirants remained from the 207 who had entered the third selection cycle at its beginning. I looked at this number. I had known the attrition rate. I had documented the attrition rate. I had contributed to the documentation that made the attrition rate function correctly. I had approved protocols that increased the attrition rate when the deadline required it. I knew the historical mortality curves. I had read the procurement document. I understood the calibration. 3 from 207. The 3 surviving aspirants were brought to the slabs. Their bodies were larger and denser, and harder than the boys from the Vareth 4 Highlands who had entered the gene vaults at the beginning of the cycle. They had been changed by everything that had happened to them and to their cohort. They were no longer the people who had chanted in the hypno-rigs, or fought in the training arenas, or been measured in the surgical theatres. They were something that was becoming something else. Their names were in the survival column of the ledger. The purity litanies began. The incisions were made. The presiding apothecary worked with the focused precision of his decades of practice. I stood at the lectern, and I recited the litanies, and I recorded the biometric readings on my slate, and I did not hesitate between the 4th and 5th lines of the 3rd invocation. The black carapace went in. All 3 survived the initial rite. I recorded this in the ledger. The entries were clean and precise. The survival column had 3 new names. 204 names were in the other column. Many of them had straight lines through them. I had drawn most of those lines. I complied with the order when it was presented to me the following morning. The compliance form was a standard administrative document. I signed it at the bottom. My signature was clear and undramatic. The form acknowledged that I understood the nature of the procedure and consented to its application, that I had been informed of the 2 alternatives and had selected this one voluntarily, and that I released the apothecarian from administrative liability for the outcomes of the selected procedure. I signed it. The form was filed. The procedure was confirmed. The neural dampening was conducted in the Medicae facility on the upper administrative level, in a room adjacent to the apothecary's Medicae suite. It was smaller than the surgical theatres and more sparsely equipped. 2 tech adepts were present. There were restraint harnesses, not because the procedure was expected to be involuntary, but because small involuntary movements during the process could affect precision. The harnesses were well padded. They fit precisely. The tech adepts moved with the efficiency of long practice. The sanctioned prayers were murmured by the senior tech adept throughout the procedure. The prayers were addressed to the Emperor and to the Omnissiah both, which was a doctrinal accommodation that the chapter had worked out with the Mechanicus representative assigned to the fortress monastery. The words were familiar in structure: invocations of purpose, affirmations of sacred utility, requests for the Emperor's blessing on the technical process being conducted. They were murmured rather than spoken, which meant they occupied the room as a texture of sound rather than as distinct statements. I was conscious throughout the procedure. This was not true of aspirants undergoing major implantation surgery, who were sedated to degrees that varied by procedure. The neural dampening was calibrated to preserve functional consciousness, while targeting specific processing pathways. The tech adepts worked through an interface device applied to the temples, which directed a specific electromagnetic and chemical intervention to the identified neural regions. What I felt was difficult to describe then, and is more difficult now. I felt the sensation one sometimes feels at the beginning of deep sleep, the quality of certain thoughts becoming less accessible, not forgotten, but moved to a position from which they were no longer in the foreground of awareness. The sensation was not painful. It was, in the sense that pain requires resistance, the opposite of painful, because there was no resistance to report. The procedure proceeded. The tech adept's instruments moved. The prayers continued. When the procedure was complete, I was released from the restraint harnesses. I sat on the edge of the medici surface and assessed my own condition in the way that I had been instructed to do. Check orientation, check basic recall, check functional assessment of assigned duties. I was oriented. My recall of my name, my position, my assigned duties, the current campaign year, the phase of the selection cycle, was intact. My functional assessment of my assigned duties was intact. There were things I knew I had known that I now knew only at a distance. The grey-brown eyes in the reclamation chamber. I knew that I had been present in the reclamation chamber during a session in which an aspirant had regained partial consciousness during extraction. I knew this as a fact, the way I knew the biometric figures from the Theatre 7 session. I did not feel the specific quality of having stood at the side of the workbench and held the stylus, and looked at the viability figure, and made myself write it. The weight of the event was attenuated. The fact was present. The weight was muted. This was the function of the procedure. I reported to the administrative wing for the resumption of my duties. The librarian's administrative confirmation of my elevation to full gene scribe status was processed and filed. I received an updated duty slate reflecting my new status. My cell assignment in the secondary archival section was maintained, though the librarian's note indicated that a primary administrative wing cell would be available at the beginning of the next selection cycle. I returned to the documentation archive for the third selection cycle and reviewed the outstanding records. The records required correction. Not in the sense of falsification. I want to be clear about this. The events recorded had occurred. The procedures had been conducted. The biometric figures were accurate. What required correction was the language. Following my elevation, I had been given formal responsibility for the cycle's documentation review. which meant that my elevated status now included authority to revise prior documentation to ensure it met archival standards. I worked through the archive systematically. I replaced the remaining instances of language that did not conform to approved terminology. In entries I had produced before the librarian's first review, there were additional instances that I had not previously caught or had not yet been flagged. I found them now and corrected them. Unnecessary became supplementary. Prolonged became extended. Elevated attrition became selection efficiency. Recovery difficulty became aspirant variance management. Each replacement was accurate in the sense that the form's categories were accurate. Each replacement was also a compression of something I had once known with more specificity. I worked through the entire cycle's documentation. The review took most of a watch period. When I was finished, the archive was clean. The language was consistent. The historical baseline review I had conducted in the deep archives was present in the documentation as a standard variance comparison with the appropriate formal framing. The procurement document I had accessed was recorded in my access log, but the log entry noted only that I had accessed historical procurement documentation as part of authorized archival review, which was accurate. The records were correct. I submitted them for final archival processing. The campaign departure was 5 days away. The final preparations for the 3 new neophytes were conducted over the following days. Additional recovery monitoring, initial power armor orientation procedures, formal presentation to the chapter's senior staff, assignment of their official chapter designations. The chapter designations replaced the Tithe World names, the clan names, the names that had been in the survival column of my ledger. This was standard practice. Neophytes who completed the full implantation sequence and were designated for active service received their chapter names at the same time they received their chapter rank. The Tithe World names were archived, but were no longer the primary designation. The chapter names were what they would be called. The 3 neophytes were presented to the chapter banner on the morning of the 4th day. I was assigned to record the ceremony. The banner hall occupied the highest level of the fortress monastery, accessible by stair rather than external approach, and its ceiling was carved stone opened in places to the mountain sky above, which meant that on clear days, light entered from above through narrow apertures. The morning was clear. The light came through in 3 narrow beams that illuminated the stone floor in precise positions that shifted slowly as the morning advanced. The chapter banner was ancient, worn at its edges but maintained with the care appropriate to a chapter relic. The colors were the chapter's primary heraldry, and the iconography on the banner's field had accumulated centuries of embellishment, each edition marked by the year of its incorporation. The banner did not look like a flag. It looked like what it was: a record. The senior apothecary stood before the banner. The chaplain in his skull helm was present. Several battle brothers of the chapter were present in ceremonial capacity. The 3 neophytes knelt. They were no longer boys from Vereth 4. They were no longer the biometric profiles in my archive. They were no longer the survivors from 207. They were, in the function the ceremony was designed to perform, something that the ceremony was now bringing into existence, named servants of the chapter, designated, recognized, assigned. Their childhood names were erased. The chaplain spoke their chapter names, and they acknowledged them. And the acknowledgement was formal and absolute. And when they rose from the kneeling position, they rose as what the chapter named them, rather than as what they had been. I recorded the ceremony in the standard format. name, designation, chapter rank, assignment, presiding officers. The records were accurate. After the ceremony, I returned to the archive and completed the final documentation for the third selection cycle. The last entry was a cycle summary. Dates of operation, total aspirant intake, total implantation completions by phase, total neophytes, advanced to full designation, total selection losses by category, gene seed recovery statistics, operational notes. The yield figure for the third selection cycle was 3 from 207. This was within historical average, adjusted for the elevated variance factors of the Warhammer 40K cohort noted in the cycle's opening documentation. The cycle summary indicated that the process had operated within doctrinal parameters throughout. The gene seed recovery statistics were excellent, high viability rates, optimal reclamation efficiency, projected implantation success rates for recovered material in line with apothecarian standards. The summary was factually accurate. I submitted it to the archival system. As the campaign departure day arrived with the same scheduled indifference that all large institutional events arrive. The timetable had been set, and the components assembled, and the preparations confirmed, and now the event was simply occurring, the way weather occurs when the conditions are met. The fortress monastery conducted a departure ceremony in the outer fortress yard, the first open space I had stood in since the beginning of the selection cycle's intensive phases. The mountain stone was dark around the yard's perimeter, and the sky above was the high pale blue of the highlands in this season, and the air had a quality of cold clarity that was entirely different from the recycled air of the lower levels, and the surgical theatres, and the archival vaults. I stood among the administrative and support staff in our designated position along the yard's southern wall. The battle brothers assembled in their formations. The chapter's banner was carried in the procession. The chaplain delivered a brief departure address. The 3 new neophytes, in their chapter designation armor pieces, stood at the rear of the formation. They were smaller than the full battle brothers ahead of them. They would continue their development during the campaign, which was the standard practice for neophytes who had completed implantation, but not yet the full cycle of combat experience required for full brother status. The formation marched. I watched them go. I had records of all 3 of them. I knew their biometric histories. I knew the phases of implantation they had survived. I knew the names they had carried before the ceremony. I knew those names because they were archived, because the archive was complete, because I had maintained the archive. The names were not what I thought of. I thought about the curve, the historical mortality curve, invariant across centuries, maintained through adjusted thresholds and environmental severity, increases, and shortened recovery windows and procurement documents, filed under standard classification with approval sigils stamped in the appropriate fields. The curve that existed, not because the process was imperfect, but because the process required it. The curve that would be maintained through the next selection cycle, and the one after that, and all the cycles down the centuries until the mountain itself was dust. I stood in the cold, clear air of the outer fortress yard, and I watched the formation move toward the transit vehicles. The neural dampening had done what it was designed to do. I knew the facts. I had the archive. The weight was attenuated, processed down to a manageable level, filed in the appropriate mental categories. The grey-brown eyes were a known data point. The straight lines in the ledger were a known data point. The 4 seconds of hesitation in the training arena were a known data point. They did not press against the categories the way they had pressed before the procedure. The procedure had been effective. I should record that the procedure had been effective. The campaign departed. The fortress monastery settled into its between-cycle operations, the state of maintained readiness that characterized it in the periods between selection cycles, when no cohort of aspirants was in active processing. The surgical theatres were cleaned and maintained. The hypno-chapels were inspected, and their rigs serviced. The training arenas were cleared. The gene vaults were inventoried. The archives were reviewed and updated. I was assigned to the documentation review for the between-cycle period, which was among the functions that my elevation to full gene scribe status had formally added to my responsibilities. The work was orderly. The archives were extensive. The fortress monastery's records went back a long time and required regular maintenance to remain accessible and useful. I reviewed selection cycle documentation. I reviewed gene seed inventory records. I reviewed tithe projection estimates for the following campaign year's intake season. I reviewed apothecarian staff rotation schedules and personnel assessments. My own personnel record had been updated to reflect the elevation and the neural dampening procedure. Both entries were factual and precise. The neural dampening entry described the procedure as prophylactic empathic stabilization, which was the approved terminology for the procedure in the Apothecarian's Personnel Management Codex. I read the entry. Prophylactic empathic stabilization. The language was accurate at the level of category. I made no note in the margin. The hypno-chapels were silent. The training arenas were silent. The surgical theatres were silent. The gene vaults held their preserved contents in the cold darkness below the mountain and waited. Now, the mountain was old, and the fortress monastery was old, and the chapter was older than either in any meaningful sense. Its history beginning long before the stone of this particular mountain had been hollowed to serve as its home. I worked in the archives. My records were accurate. My language conformed to approved terminology throughout. My documentation met the chapter's archival standards. My elevation to full gene scribe status was reflected in the quality of the work I produced. The catechisms from the hypno-chapels were silent now, but I could recall them in the technical sense. I knew the words, knew the structure, knew the cadence. I am the instrument of the Emperor's will, and my will is the Emperor's. I could recite them. I had recited them in the chapel of the third selection cycle's ritual phases. And I would recite them in the next cycle when the aspirants from the fourth tithe arrived. The aspiration would be the same. 200, 210, 215 aspirants, drawn from the Verath Four Highlands, or wherever the tithe ship was sent that season, some of them with Highland clan names, some of them with coastal names, some of them with designations that were unpronounceable in standard Gothic script, all of them assessed against the biometric criteria, all of them beginning the rites. The ledger would be opened, the purity litanies would begin, the curve would be maintained. I sat in the archives with the data slates and the parchment and the recycled air, and I did not feel the weight of this as I had once felt it. I knew the content of what I was describing, but the content had been processed to the point where it occupied its appropriate category, without excess. It was simply the design. It had always been the design. I was part of the design in the way that the lectern of bone and brass was part of the design, in the way that the chronometers in the surgical theatres were part of the design, in the way that the incinerators in the reclamation chamber were part of the design. Each component served its function. Each component's function served the whole. The design was ancient. The design had endured. The design produced what it was designed to produce. And what it was designed to produce was not merely the three figures who had knelt before the chapter banner, though they were part of the yield. What it was designed to produce was the process itself. The curve, the calibration, the story of the forging, the truth that the warriors who emerged from it had been made by something that could kill them and had not, or had almost, or had killed 204 of their cohort, which was a truth written in the structure of their bodies and their psychology and their doctrine and their chapter name. I understood this. I understood it without the weight I had once carried toward it. The weight had been the problem. The weight had been the empathic residue. The weight had been the unofficial ledger, the one that existed in the spaces between official entries. That ledger had been the source of the language deviations, the 11 instances, the word unnecessary appearing where optimal was required, and the word excessive appearing where enhanced was correct. The weight was attenuated now. The official ledger was the ledger. I reviewed the archival entry for the third selection cycle. The summary was accurate. The yield was 3. The selection losses were within historical parameters. The gene seed recovery statistics were excellent. The process had operated within doctrinal parameters throughout. It was correct. I saved the review and submitted it for secondary archival confirmation. In the silence of the between-cycle period, with the surgical theatres empty and the hypno-chapels offline and the training arenas cleared and the 3 new neophytes deployed on campaign with their brothers, the fortress monastery went about its maintenance routines with the steady, impersonal efficiency of a machine that had never stopped being a machine and would not stop. The catechisms would resume. The aspirants would come. The rites would begin. I would stand at the lectern of bone and brass and recite the purity litanies at the correct cadence, and I would record all biometric deviations on the slate, and I would draw straight lines when straight lines were required. The ledger would open. The yield would be tracked. In the gene vaults below the mountain, the preserved material waited in its cold alcoves. Gene seed from chapter brothers going back generations, recovered from battle brothers fallen in 100 campaigns, reclaimed from aspirants who had failed the rites, but maintained in its canister, suspension with the care appropriate to something that carried the Emperor's legacy in organic form. The gene seed did not know what it was part of. It simply was what it was, the continuation of a process that would not end, that had not ended, that had been running since the first founding and would run until the Imperium itself was dust. The mountain endured. The fortress monastery endured. The chapter endured. And below the mountain, in the cold dark of the gene vaults, the next cycle was already beginning in the sense that everything that would constitute it was in place. The tithe projections, the intake schedules, the theatrical rosters, the litany cards on the bone and brass lecterns. The aspirants had not arrived yet. That was all. They would arrive. And I would be standing at the lectern when they did, with my slate and my stylus and my records and my straight lines, and the purity litanies would begin, and the rites would begin, and the ledger would open. The process would proceed as it had always proceeded, not because I no longer saw what I had once seen, because I no longer felt the weight of it, in a way that produced excess. The catechisms echoed in the empty hypno-chapels as maintenance personnel ran diagnostic checks on the suspension rigs. The sound carried differently in the empty chambers. Longer reverb, sharper echo. I could hear it from the archive corridor when the chapel doors were open. I am the instrument of the Emperor's will, and my will is the Emperor's. The diagnostic echo returned it in a fragmented form, the phrase broken across the stone walls and returning as parts rather than as a whole. I closed the archive door. The sound stopped. The ledger now read perfectly balanced. Casualty percentages aligned with historical averages, adjusted for cohort variance factors, documented in the approved terminology, with the approved framing and the approved category designations. The records were what the records were required to be. I was what I was required to be. The process was what it was required to be. Space Marine training continued below the mountain. The catechisms echoed without deviation. What remained was not doubt, nor rebellion, nor grief. It was alignment. I no longer questioned whether the suffering was necessary. I understood it was the point.